An alien mother, desperate and hungry, tries to steal from a human farm, only to collapse, begging for help. A starving child, a broken planet, and an unlikely bond between a grieving man and a warrior from the stars. Will Elias Kane's simple life on Arcturus V be the salvation they need? Or will the winds of war and survival tear them apart before they can truly find peace? Discover the power of mercy, survival, and the unexpected bonds that shape us in this gripping HFY story. If you are moved by this story of survival, sacrifice, and unexpected connections, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more gripping HFY tales. Share your thoughts in the comments. How do you think Elias will navigate his new life with Vera and Lila? Will he face even greater challenges ahead? Stay tuned for the next chapter in their journey. Join our adventure, and let's explore the stars together. Despair is not a sin, but a signal. On the forsaken rock of Arcturus V, where winds carved scars into the earth and dust swirled like forgotten promises, Elias Kane stood alone. His hands, calloused from years of coaxing life from barren soil, gripped the handle of a worn spade. Once a scientist, a man of labs and star charts, he was now a farmer, tethered to a land that seemed to resent his every effort. The sky above bled gold into rust, a bruised tapestry that mirrored the weight in his chest. Arcturus V was no place for dreams, but it was the only place Elias could bury his past. The planet was a relic of ambition gone wrong. Decades ago, colonists had arrived with grand plans to terraform its red deserts into green fields. They brought machines, seeds, and promises of a new Eden. But the soil was stubborn, the water scarce, and the storms relentless. One by one, the settlers left, their domes abandoned to the creeping dust. Elias stayed, not out of hope, but because running felt too much like surrender. He had lost too much to believe in fresh starts. His farm was a patchwork of defiance, a small cabin pieced together from salvaged metal, a greenhouse that hummed with recycled air, and rows of crops that clung to life under protective mesh. The plants were hybrids, engineered to survive the planet's harshness, but they demanded constant care. Elias worked from dawn to dusk, his body lean and hardened by labor, his dark hair streaked with premature gray. At 38, he looked older, his hazel eyes carrying the weight of years spent mourning what could not be undone. Once he had been Dr. Elias Kane, a xenobiologist studying alien ecosystems on thriving colonies. His work had taken him to worlds where oceans glowed and forests whispered secrets. He had a wife, Mara, whose laugh could light up a room, and a son, Caleb, who dreamed of being a pilot. But war came, a clash of corporations and colonies over resources, and with it, disease. Caleb fell ill, a fever that burned through him in days. The colony's medics, stretched thin, prioritized the wealthy. Mara followed soon after, her heart broken by grief. Elias buried them both, their graves marked by stones he carried himself. When the colony collapsed, he fled to Arcturus V, seeking a place where no one would ask his name. Now, his days were a rhythm of survival. He woke before dawn, checked the greenhouse's filters, and tended the crops. The silence was his companion, broken only by the howl of the wind or the hum of his solar panels. He ate simple meals, grain porridge, dried vegetables, the occasional protein bar from his dwindling stores. At night, he sat on the cabin's porch, watching the stars, their cold light a reminder of how far he had fallen. Arcturus V was his exile, his penance, and he had made peace with it. Or so he thought. Tonight, the air was heavy, the kind of stillness that preceded a storm. Elias stood at the edge of his field, the spade resting against his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the cracked earth. He was about to turn back to the cabin when something caught his eye, a flicker of movement beyond the wire fence that marked his property. At first, he thought it was a dust devil, a common sight on Arcturus V. But the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful. He squinted, his hand tightening on the spade. The fence was low, more a marker than a barrier, but was enough to keep out the planet's few native creatures, small, skittering things that burrowed beneath the sand. This was no animal. It was a figure, low and quick, darting between the rows of his crops. A thief. Elias's pulse quickened. Thieves were rare on Arcturus V. Most settlers had left, and the nearest outpost was a 3-day trek across the dunes. But desperation drove people to strange places. He had heard stories of scavengers, survivors of failed colonies who roamed the wastes, taking what they could. He had never encountered one, but he was prepared. The spade was heavy in his hands, a tool and a weapon. He moved quietly, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The figure was near the storage shed, a metal box where he kept his surplus grain and roots. The shed was locked, but a determined thief could pry it open with the right tools. Elias crept closer, staying low, his breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The figure was small, hunched, and carried something in its arms. A sack, perhaps, for whatever they could steal. As he reached the edge of the field, the figure turned, sensing his presence. Elias froze, his spade raised, ready to confront the intruder. But what he saw stopped him cold. It was no human scavenger. It was a woman, or something close to one. Her skin was a pale violet, shimmering faintly under the fading light, like moonlight caught on water. Her hair was a cascade of silver, tangled and wild, framing a face that was both alien and achingly familiar. Her eyes, large and luminous, glowed a soft amber, wide with fear. In her arms, she held a child no older than 6, with the same violet skin and silver hair. The child clung to her, her small body trembling, her eyes fixed on Elias with a mixture of terror and defiance. The woman's clothing was tattered, a patchwork of fabric that barely covered her. She was thin, her frame gaunt, her movements unsteady as if she hadn't eaten in days. For a moment, they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Elias's spade hovered, his instincts warring with his curiosity. He had heard of alien refugees, survivors of distant wars who sought asylum on human worlds. Arcturus V was too remote for most, but desperation could drive anyone to its shores. The woman's eyes darted to the shed, then back to him, calculating her chances of escape. "Don't move," Elias said, his voice low but firm. "You're on my land." The woman's lips parted, but no sound came at first. She took a step back, clutching the child tighter. The child whimpered, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. Elias lowered the spade slightly, his grip still tight. He didn't want to hurt them, but he couldn't let them take what little he had. His crops were his lifeline, the only thing keeping him alive in this wasteland. "I don't want trouble," he said, softening his tone. "Just put down whatever you took and leave." The woman's eyes flickered with something. Fear, yes, but also a fierce determination. She straightened, though her body trembled with the effort. When she spoke, her voice was raw, accented, as if English were a language she had learned under duress. "Please," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "My daughter is hungry." The plea hit Elias like a physical blow. He looked at the child, her small frame curled against her mother, her eyes peeking out, wide and pleading. He saw the hollows in their cheeks, the way the mother's hands shook as she held her daughter. Hunger was a language he understood, a pain he had felt in the early days of his exile, when supplies ran low and hope was a distant memory. He lowered the spade, letting it rest against the ground. His mind raced, weighing the risks. Helping them could bring trouble, patrols, questions, accusations of harboring illegals. But turning them away felt like betraying something fundamental, something he had lost when he buried his family. Caleb's face flashed in his mind, his son's laughter echoing across the years. "What's your name?" Elias asked, his voice gentler now. The woman hesitated, as if giving her name were a surrender. "Vera," she said finally. "This is Lila." Elias nodded, his eyes moving between them. "How about food inside?" he said. "Come with me." Vera's eyes narrowed, suspicion warring with desperation. She glanced at the shed, then back at him, as if expecting a trap. But Lila's soft whimper seemed to decide for her. She nodded, her shoulders sagging with relief or exhaustion, or both. Elias turned, gesturing for them to follow. As they walked toward the cabin, the wind picked up, carrying dust that stung his eyes. He didn't look back, but he felt their presence behind him, a weight that was both burden and possibility. Something stirred in him, a flicker of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Arcturus V was a place of endings, but tonight it might just be the start of something new. The wind howled outside Elias Kane's cabin, a mournful wail that rattled the metal walls and sent dust seeping through the cracks. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the scent of grain porridge simmering on a small stove. Elias stood at the threshold, his spade propped against the wall, his eyes fixed on Vera and her daughter, Lila. The alien mother sat on a stool, her violet skin catching the dim light of a solar lamp. Lila clung to her side, her silver hair tangled, her amber eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The cabin, once a solitary refuge, felt suddenly crowded, alive with the weight of their presence. Vera's plea still echoed in Elias's mind. "My daughter is hungry." Those words had disarmed him, cracking open a part of himself he'd long buried. He didn't know what he was doing, inviting strangers, alien strangers, into his home. Arcturus V was no place for charity. The patrols roamed the dunes, their scanners sharp for unauthorized settlers. Harboring refugees could cost him his farm, his freedom, maybe more. But as he looked at Lila, her small hands clutching her mother's tattered sleeve, he saw Caleb's face, his son's frail body in those final days. He couldn't turn them away. "Stay there," Elias said, his voice steady but not unkind. He crossed to the stove, stirring the porridge with a wooden spoon. The motion was automatic, a ritual that grounded him. He ladled the steaming mixture into 2 bowls, adding a drizzle of syrup from a jar he kept for rare moments of indulgence. The syrup was a luxury, traded from a passing merchant years ago, but tonight felt like a night for exceptions. He set the bowls on the table, along with a jug of water and 2 chipped mugs. "Eat," he said, stepping back to give him space. "It's not much, but it's warm." Vera hesitated, her eyes flicking from the food to Elias, searching for a catch. Her posture was tense, like a coiled spring, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Lila, though, had no such reservations. She reached for the bowl, her small fingers trembling as she scooped a spoonful of porridge. She ate quickly, almost desperately, the soft clink of the spoon against the bowl the only sound in the room. Vera watched her daughter for a moment, her expression softening. Then she took her own bowl, eating more slowly, as if savoring each bite. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, still carrying that raw edge of exhaustion. "We haven't eaten in days." Elias nodded, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed. He wanted to ask where they'd come from, how they'd ended up on his land, but the questions felt intrusive, like probing a wound. Instead, he watched them eat, noting the way Vera's hands shook, the way her breathing hitched with each movement. She was hurt, he realized, more than she'd let on. "Where are you headed?" he asked finally, keeping his tone neutral. Vera's eyes met his, guarded but not hostile. "Nowhere," she said. "There's nowhere left for us." The words hung in the air, heavy with a truth Elias understood too well. Arcturus V was a planet of exiles, a graveyard for broken dreams. He didn't press further. Instead, he poured water into the mugs, sliding them across the table. "You can stay the night," he said. "Storm's coming. It's not safe out there." Vera's lips parted, as if to protest, but Lila's soft yawn stopped her. The girl's eyelids were drooping, her bowl nearly empty. Vera nodded, a flicker of gratitude in her amber eyes. "Just one night," she said. Elias showed them to a corner of the cabin where he kept a spare cot, a relic from his early days when he'd hoped for company that never came. He spread a worn blanket over it, the fabric rough but clean. Lila curled up immediately, her small body sinking into the cot, her breathing slowing as sleep claimed her. Vera sat beside her, stroking her daughter's hair, her own body still tense, as if rest were a luxury, she couldn't afford. Elias turned to leave, intending to give them privacy, but a sharp gasp stopped him. He glanced back to see Vera clutching her leg, her face contorted in pain. She tried to hide it, but the effort only made her tremble more. Elias crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside her. "You're hurt," he said, his voice firm but not accusing. "Let me see." Vera shook her head, pulling her leg away. "It's nothing. I'll manage." "It's not nothing," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're no good to her if you collapse." He gestured to Lila, who slept soundly, unaware of her mother's struggle. Vera's eyes flickered with defiance, but exhaustion won out. She nodded, rolling up the tattered fabric of her pants to reveal a jagged wound on her calf. The skin around it was swollen, the violet hue darkened to an angry purple, streaked with infection. Elias sucked in a breath. He'd seen wounds like this in the colonies, untreated injuries that turned deadly fast. "Stay still," he said, rising to fetch his med kit. The kit was basic: bandages, antiseptic, a few stims for pain, but it was all he had. He returned, setting it on the floor beside her. As he cleaned the wound, the antiseptic's sharp scent filled the air, mingling with the faint, unfamiliar fragrance of Vera's skin, like desert blooms after rain. His hands worked with the precision of his old life, the scientist's focus overriding his farmer's calluses. Vera winced, but didn't pull away. Their eyes met briefly, and Elias felt a strange warmth, a connection that startled him. Her gaze was intense, not just grateful, but searching, as if trying to read his soul. When his fingers brushed hers while adjusting the bandage, a spark seemed to pass between them, fleeting but undeniable. He pulled back, focusing on the task, his heart beating faster than it should. "This'll hold for now," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "But you need rest. Real rest." Vera's lips curved in a faint, weary smile. "Rest is a dream we left behind," she said, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. She glanced at Lila, her expression softening. "But for her, I'll try." Elias wrapped the bandage tightly, securing it with tape. He sat back on his heels, studying her. The wound wasn't fatal, not yet, but it was a warning. She'd been running, hiding, surviving on scraps of hope. He didn't know her story, but he recognized the look in her eyes, the same hollow resolve he'd seen in the mirror after Mara and Caleb were gone. "You're safe here," he said, the words surprising him as much as her. He didn't know if he could keep that promise, not with patrols and storms and a world that punished kindness. But he meant it, at least for tonight. Vera's eyes softened, a flicker of trust breaking through her guard. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know us." Elias looked away, his gaze settling on the flickering lamp. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," he said. "And because he nodded toward Lila, deserves better than this." Vera followed his gaze, her hand resting on Lila's shoulder. The girl stirred in her sleep, murmuring something in a language Elias didn't understand. For a moment, the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a crossroads, a place where paths converged for better or worse. Elias stood, brushing dust from his knees. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." He moved to his own cot across the room, the floor creaking under his boots. As he lay down, the wind outside grew louder, a reminder of the world beyond these walls. Sleep didn't come easily. His mind churned with questions about Vera, about Lila, about the risks he was taking. But beneath the doubt, there was something else, a spark of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't facing it alone. The dawn on Arcturus V was a quiet affair, a slow bleed of light across the sky, too weary to hold color. Elias Kane rose before the sun, his body attuned to the rhythm of survival. The cabin was still, save for the soft hum of the greenhouse filters and the faint rustle of wind against the walls. He glanced at the corner where Vera and Lila slept, their forms huddled beneath the blanket on the cot. Lila's silver hair spilled across her mother's arm, and Vera's face, even in sleep, carried a tension that spoke of battles fought in dreams. Elias turned away, his boots silent on the floor, and stepped outside to face the day. The air was sharp, carrying the metallic tang of dust. He checked the greenhouse first, adjusting the moisture levels to coax another yield from the stubborn crops. The plants were his lifeline, hybrids of earth grains and alien roots, their leaves a pale green under the protective mesh. He worked methodically, his hands moving with the precision of his old life as a xenobiologist. But his mind was elsewhere, tangled in the events of the night before. Vera's plea, Lila's frightened eyes, the warmth of Vera's touch when their fingers brushed, it all lingered, like a melody he couldn't shake. Back in the cabin, he prepared breakfast. More porridge, this time with a handful of dried berries he'd saved for lean days. The scent filled the small space, a modest offering to the strangers who had upended his solitude. As he stirred the pot, Vera stirred, her amber eyes blinking open. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake Lila, and ran a hand through her tangled silver hair. Her wound, bandaged tightly, seemed less swollen, but her movements were cautious, as if pain were a constant companion. "Morning," Elias said, keeping his voice low. He nodded toward the stove. "Food's almost ready." Vera's gaze followed his, and a flicker of surprise crossed her face, as if kindness were a language she'd forgotten. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We'll leave soon. We don't want to be a burden." Elias shook his head, ladling porridge into bowls. "You're not leaving until that leg's better," he said, and not in a storm. "Eat first, then we'll talk." Vera hesitated, her eyes searching his face for hidden motives. Finding none, she nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She gently woke Lila, who rubbed her eyes and sat up, her small frame dwarfed by the blanket. The girl's gaze darted to Elias, wary but less fearful than the night before. He set the bowls on the table, along with water and a few berries scattered like jewels atop the porridge. Lila's eyes widened at the sight, and she reached for a berry, popping it into her mouth with a shy smile. They ate in silence at first, the clink of spoons a fragile bridge between them. Elias sat across from them, his own bowl untouched, watching the way Vera ensured Lila ate first, her own bites measured, as if food were a resource too precious to waste. The act was familiar, a mother's sacrifice, and it stirred memories of Mara, who had done the same for Caleb in their final days. The ache in his chest was sharp, but he pushed it down, focusing on the present. "Where are you from?" Elias asked, breaking the silence. The question had burned in him since last night, but he'd held back, sensing Vera's guardedness. Now, with the morning light softening the cabin's edges, it felt safe to ask. Vera's spoon paused mid-air, her eyes distant. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she set the spoon down, her hands folding in her lap. "Zirin," she said, the word carrying a weight that filled the room. "A world of rivers and forests, where the air sang with life. My people were healers, scholars, builders. We lived in harmony, or so we thought." She paused, her gaze drifting to Lila, who was tracing patterns in her porridge with a spoon. "Then your kind came," Vera continued, her voice steady but laced with pain. "Humans with their ships and their hunger for resources. They offered trade, then took what they wanted. Our rivers dried, our forests burned. Those who resisted were killed or caged. I was a healer trained to mend bodies and spirits, but I couldn't save my home." Elias listened, his jaw tight. He'd seen the greed of corporations firsthand, the way they stripped world bare and called it progress. His own colony had fallen to similar forces, leaving him with nothing but grief. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Vera's fingers tightened around her mug. "We fled," she said. "Me, Lila, and a few others. We found refuge on a human colony, but it was no sanctuary. They put us in camps, called us displaced assets. Food was scarce, medicine scarcer. Lila got sick, and her voice broke, and she looked away, her eyes glistening. I stole to keep her alive. When they caught me, they sent us here to Arcturus V as punishment. They said it was a chance to start over, but it's just another cage. Lila reached for her mother's hand, her small fingers curling around Vera's. The gesture was so tender, so human, that Elias felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he stood, clearing the bowls to give himself a moment to think. The story wasn't new. War, displacement, survival. But hearing it from Vera, seeing it in Lila's eyes, made it real in a way he hadn't expected. "I'm sorry," he said finally, turning back to them. "I know what it's like to lose everything." Vera's eyes met his, searching. "Do you?" she asked, not accusing but curious, as if she sensed the weight he carried. Elias sat down, his hands resting on the table, scarred and worn from years of labor. "I was a scientist once," he said, the words heavy with memory. "Studied alien worlds, their plants, their creatures. I had a family, my wife, Mara, and our son, Caleb. We lived on a colony, a good one, until the wars came. Corporations fought over mining rights, and disease followed. Caleb got sick. The medics wouldn't help, said we weren't priority. He died in my arms. Mara didn't last long after that. Grief took her." He paused, his gaze fixed on the table, where a faint crack ran through the wood like a scar. "I buried them both. When the colony fell, I came here, thought I could leave it all behind. But you don't leave pain. You just carry it." The cabin was silent, the weight of their shared losses filling the space. Vera's expression softened, her guard lowering for the first time. "You stayed," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Why?" Elias shrugged, a faint, bitter smile tugging at his lips. "Didn't know what else to do. This place is hard, but it's honest. The land doesn't lie to you." Vera nodded, as if she understood. Lila, sensing the shift in mood, slid off her stool and wandered to the cabin's wall, where a blank panel caught her eye. She reached into her tattered pocket, pulling out a small piece of chalk, and began to draw. Her strokes were hesitant at first, then bolder, forming shapes that Elias couldn't quite make out. A river, perhaps, or a tree. "She draws to remember," Vera said, watching her daughter. "Zirin, our home. She was so young when we left, but she holds it in her heart." Elias watched Lila, the chalk moving with a child's earnestness. The drawings were simple but vivid, a glimpse of a world he'd never know. "She's strong," he said, "like her mother." Vera's lips curved in a faint smile, but her eyes were heavy with doubt. "Strength is all I have left," she said. "But it's not enough. Not for her." The words hung between them, a challenge and a confession. Elias felt an urge to reach out, to bridge the gap between their stories, but he held back, unsure of his place. Instead, he stood, gesturing toward the door. "Come with me," he said. "I could use a hand in the greenhouse. Fresh air might do you both good." Vera hesitated, glancing at Lila, who was still drawing, lost in her world. "She'll be safe here," Elias said. "The cabin's secure, and I'll keep an eye on her." Vera nodded, rising carefully, her leg still tender. They stepped outside, the morning light harsh but clean. The greenhouse was a short walk, its transparent panels glinting like a beacon against the red earth. Inside, the air was humid, thick with the scent of growing things. Elias handed Vera a tray of seedlings, their roots delicate and pale. "These need planting," he said. "Just press them into the soil like this." He demonstrated, his hands steady as he worked the earth. Vera followed, her movements tentative at first, then more confident. They worked side by side, the silence comfortable now, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves and the hum of the filters. As they reached for the same tray, their fingers brushed, and Elias felt that same warmth from the night before, a quiet spark that lingered in his chest. Vera's eyes met his, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just them, two souls finding solace in shared labor. "You're good at this," Elias said, breaking the silence. "Got a healer's touch." Vera's smile was small but genuine. "On Zirin, we grew herbs that sang when you touched them," she said. "This is different, but it feels right." Elias nodded, his gaze lingering on her. The greenhouse felt alive, not just with plants, but with possibility. Back in the cabin, Lila's drawings grew. A river, a tree, a figure with silver hair and amber eyes, surrounded by stars. The chalk lines were a promise, a bridge between past and future, and Elias felt their weight, knowing he was part of it now, whether he was ready or not. The days on Arcturus V began to blur into a rhythm of shared survival. Elias Kane woke each morning to the soft hum of the greenhouse filters and the quiet presence of Vera and Lila in his cabin. The alien mother and daughter had become part of his world, their footsteps mingling with his own on the dusty floors. Vera's leg was healing, the swelling reduced to a faint bruise, and Lila's laughter, once rare, now echoed through the cabin as she added new drawings to the walls. Rivers, stars, and figures holding hands under a hopeful sky. Elias found himself lingering over these moments, the weight of his solitude lighter than it had been in years. The greenhouse had become their sanctuary. Vera's knowledge of alien flora transformed the struggling crops, her healer's instincts coaxing life from even the most stubborn roots. Elias watched her work, her violet fingers deft as they pressed seedlings into the soil, her silver hair catching the filtered light like a halo. Their hands brushed often now, each touch a quiet spark that neither acknowledged but both felt. The air between them was charged, not with urgency, but with possibility, a slow-growing trust that rooted itself deeper with each passing day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of ash and ember, Elias and Vera sat at the table, sharing a meal of roasted roots and grain flatbread. Lila, her energy spent from a day of exploring the greenhouse, had fallen asleep on the cot, her chalk drawings glowing faintly under the solar lamp. The cabin was warm, the wind outside a distant murmur, and for a moment, it felt like a home, not just a shelter. "You've done something to this place," Elias said, breaking the comfortable silence. He gestured to the walls, where Lila's drawings had turned the stark panels into a canvas of memory and hope. "It's alive now." Vera's amber eyes softened, a faint smile curving her lips. "It was always alive," she said. "You just needed someone to see it." Elias looked at her, his heart stirring. Her words carried a weight that went beyond the cabin, touching the part of him that had been buried with Mara and Caleb. He wanted to say something, to bridge the space between them, but before he could, a sharp cry pierced the night, high and desperate, coming from beyond the fence. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his spade in hand, before he fully registered the sound. Vera followed, her body tense, her healer's instincts overriding her caution. "Stay with Lila," Elias said, his voice low but firm. "No," Vera said, her eyes fierce. "If someone's hurt, I can help." Elias hesitated, then nodded, recognizing the resolve in her gaze. They stepped outside, the wind biting at their skin, the darkness thick with the threat of storm. The cry came again, weaker now, guiding them toward the edge of the field. Elias's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing a small figure slumped against the wire fence. It was a boy, no older than Lila, his skin a deep indigo, his breathing shallow. His clothes were rags, torn and blood-stained, and his arm was bent at an unnatural angle. Vera knelt beside him, her hands moving with practiced precision. "He's in shock," she said, her voice steady despite the urgency. "Broken arm, maybe internal injuries. We need to get him inside." Elias didn't question her. He lifted the boy gently, his muscles straining under the weight of responsibility. The boy's eyes fluttered open, a faint glow of green in the darkness, and he murmured something in a language Elias didn't understand. Vera answered in the same tongue, her voice soothing, a lullaby against the wind. Back in the cabin, they laid the boy on the table, pushing aside the remnants of their meal. Lila stirred, her eyes wide with fear as she saw the stranger. "Mama," she whispered, clutching the blanket. "It's okay, Lila," Vera said, her tone calm but firm. "Stay there. I need to help him." Elias fetched the med kit, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Vera worked quickly, cleaning the boy's wounds with antiseptic, her fingers deft as she splinted his arm with strips of wooden tape. The boy whimpered, his body trembling, but Vera's touch seemed to anchor him, her voice a constant murmur of reassurance. Elias watched, awed by her skill, her strength. She was no longer just a refugee, a mother fighting for survival. She was a healer, reclaiming her purpose in the face of despair. "He's stable," Vera said finally, stepping back, her hands stained with blood and antiseptic. "But he needs rest, fluids, food when he's stronger. He's been through hell." Elias nodded, his gaze shifting to the boy, whose breathing had steadied, his green eyes closed in fitful sleep. "Who is he?" he asked. "Another refugee?" Vera's expression darkened. "His name is Taro," she said, her voice low. "He was in the camp with us. The patrols, they don't care about children. They leave the weak to die." The words hit Elias like a blow. He'd heard rumors of the camps, makeshift prisons where alien refugees were dumped, their lives reduced to numbers on a ledger. But seeing Taro, his small body broken by neglect, made the reality visceral. Anger flared in him, a fire he hadn't felt since the colony wars. "How'd he get here?" he asked. Vera shook her head. "He must have escaped, same as us. The camps are chaos, guards, disease, starvation. Some run, but most don't make it." Elias looked at Taro, then at Lila, who had crept closer, her eyes fixed on the boy. "Will he be okay?" she asked, her voice small. Vera knelt beside her, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. "He will, because we're here," she said. "We won't let him go." Lila nodded, her fear easing, and returned to her cot, clutching her chalk as if it could ward off the darkness. Elias felt a surge of protectiveness, not just for Lila and Taro, but for Vera, who carried the weight of their survival. He reached out, his hand resting on her arm, a gesture meant to comfort, but sparking something deeper. Her skin was warm under his touch, her amber eyes meeting his with a mix of gratitude and something else, something that made his pulse quicken. "We'll keep him safe," Elias said, his voice rough with conviction. "All of you." Vera's hand covered his, her touch a quiet vow. "Together," she said, the word a bridge between their worlds. But their moment of unity was short-lived. As dawn broke, a low rumble echoed across the dunes, a sound Elias knew too well, the growl of a patrol rover. Dust clouds rose on the horizon, moving fast toward the farm. His stomach twisted. Patrols were rare this far out, but they were thorough, their scanners capable of detecting alien biosignatures. Taro's arrival, Vera's presence, Lila's drawings, all of it could betray them. "We need to hide them," Elias said, his mind racing. He turned to Vera, who was already gathering blankets to cover Taro. "The greenhouse. There's a storage compartment under the floor. It's tight, but it'll block scans." Vera nodded, her face set with determination. She lifted Taro, wincing as her leg protested, and followed Elias to the greenhouse. Lila trailed behind, clutching her mother's hand, her eyes wide with fear. Elias' pride opened the compartment, a narrow space lined with insulation, and helped Vera lower Taro inside. The boy stirred, murmuring in pain, but Vera's soothing words calmed him. Lila climbed in next, curling up beside Taro, her small body a shield. Vera hesitated, her eyes meeting Elias's. "If they find us," she began, her voice trembling. "They won't," Elias said, his tone fierce. "I'll handle it." She nodded, her hand brushing his as she climbed into the compartment. The touch was fleeting, but it burned, a reminder of what was at stake. Elias sealed the compartment, covering it with soil and tools, then returned to the cabin, his heart pounding. The rover's rumble was closer now, its lights cutting through the morning haze. He grabbed his spade, not as a weapon, but as a prop, a farmer's tool to mask his fear. As the rover pulled up, Elias stepped outside, his stance casual, but his eyes sharp. The patrol was small, 2 officers in dust-streaked uniforms, their faces hidden behind visors. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a sergeant's insignia, stepped forward, his scanner humming in his hand. "Kane," the sergeant said, his voice clipped. Routine check. Been reports of strays in the sector. Elias shrugged, leaning on his spade. Just me and the crops, as always, he said, his tone easy. You're welcome to look, but it's a long way for nothing. The sergeant's eyes narrowed, his scanner sweeping the cabin. Elias held his breath, praying the compartment's insulation held. The second officer circled the greenhouse, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Every sound was a knife to Elias's nerves, but he kept his face neutral, his grip on the spade steady. Got a lot of new growth in there, the sergeant said, nodding toward the greenhouse. More than a man alone needs. Elias forced a smile. Got lucky with the hybrids this year, he said. You want some roots for the road? The sergeant didn't laugh. He stepped closer, his scanner beeping faintly. We'll see, he said, his voice cold. Let's take a closer look. Elias's heart sank, but he nodded, leading the way to the greenhouse, his mind racing for a plan. The stakes were higher now, not just his farm, but the lives of Vera, Lila, and Taro. He glanced at the horizon, where the dust clouds swirled, and felt the weight of their trust, a fire that burned brighter than fear. The dust clouds churned around Elias Kane's farm, a restless veil that cloaked the approaching patrol rover in an ominous haze. The greenhouse loomed behind him, its transparent panels glinting under the weak morning light of Arcturus V. Elias stood firm, his spade gripped loosely in one hand, its weight a grounding force against the storm brewing in his chest. The sergeant's scanner hummed, a cold, mechanical sound that cut through the wind's low moan. The second officer lingered near the greenhouse, his boots scuffing the earth, too close to the hidden compartment where Vera, Lila, and Taro lay concealed. Elias's pulse thundered, but his face remained a mask of calm, honed by years of solitude and survival. The sergeant, a man whose broad frame seemed carved from the same unyielding rock as the planet, stepped closer, his visor reflecting Elias's weathered features. You're awfully calm for a man alone out here, Kane, he said, his voice laced with suspicion. The scanner beeped again, its rhythm quickening as it swept the greenhouse. Mind if we take a look inside? Elias shrugged, forcing a casual tone. Be my guest, he said, gesturing toward the greenhouse with the spade. Just crops and dirt. Might bore you. The sergeant didn't smile. He nodded to the second officer, who moved toward the greenhouse door, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Elias's stomach twisted, but he kept his stance relaxed, leaning slightly on the spade as if this were just another morning. Inside, he was calculating how long it would take to distract them, whether the compartment's insulation would hold against the scanner's probes, what he'd do if they found Vera and the children. The thought of losing them, after all they'd shared, was a blade sharper than any he'd faced. As the officer pushed open the greenhouse door, Elias spoke up, his voice steady but edged with intent. You said strays, he said, locking eyes with the sergeant. What kind? People? Animals? I've seen nothing but dust for months. The sergeant's gaze narrowed, but he answered, perhaps to keep Elias talking. Refugees, he said. Aliens, mostly. Escaped from the camps. Dangerous types, stealing from honest folk like you. Elias raised an eyebrow, letting a hint of skepticism show. Dangerous? Out here, they'd be lucky to survive the storms, let alone cause trouble. He gestured to the horizon, where the dust clouds swirled like a warning. If I saw any, I'd tell you. No sense risking my farm for strangers. The sergeant studied him, his scanner still humming. Elias held his gaze, his heart pounding, but his expression unyielding. He'd learned long ago how to lie with the truth, a skill born of necessity in the colony wars. The officer inside the greenhouse moved slowly, his flashlight beam dancing across the rows of crops, lingering on the tools scattered near the compartment. Elias's grip on the spade tightened, his mind racing for a diversion. Before he could act, a sharp gust of wind slammed against the greenhouse, rattling the panels and sending a cloud of dust billowing through the open door. The officer cursed, shielding his eyes, and Elias seized the moment. Storm's picking up, he said, raising his voice over the wind. You sure you want to be poking around in there? Last time a patrol got caught in a blow, they lost a rover. The sergeant hesitated, glancing at the darkening sky. Storms on Arcturus V were brutal, capable of shredding equipment and stranding travelers for days. He signaled to the officer, who stepped out of the greenhouse, brushing dust from his uniform. "Anything?" the sergeant asked. The officer shook his head. "Just plants. Looks clean." Elias exhaled silently, his relief tempered by caution. The sergeant's scanner beeped one last time, then fell silent, its readings inconclusive. He lowered it, his eyes still fixed on Elias. "You're a long way from help out here, Kane," he said, his tone a warning. "If you're hiding something, we'll find out. And it won't go easy." Elias met his gaze, unflinching. "I've got nothing to hide," he said. "Just trying to keep the crops alive. You know how it is." The sergeant held his stare for a long moment, then turned to the rover. "Let's move," he called to the officer. "We've got other sectors to check." The officer climbed into the rover, and the sergeant followed, casting one last glance at Elias. The engine roared, kicking up more dust as the vehicle rolled away, its lights fading into the haze. Elias stood motionless, watching until the rover was a speck on the horizon, until the wind swallowed its sound. Only then did he let his shoulders sag, the spade slipping from his hand to rest against the earth. He moved quickly to the greenhouse, his boots crunching on the dry soil. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of growing things, a stark contrast to the barren world outside. He knelt by the compartment, brushing aside the soil and tools, and lifted the panel. Vera's face appeared first, her amber eyes wide with a mix of fear and relief. She climbed out, helping Lila and Taro, who clung to her, their small bodies trembling from the cramped space and the weight of their fear. "They're gone," Elias said, his voice softer now. "You're safe." Vera nodded, her hand resting on Lila's shoulder, her other arm supporting Taro, who was pale but awake. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "If they found us—" "They didn't," Elias said, cutting her off gently. "And they won't. Not while I'm here." Lila looked up at him, her silver hair catching the light, her eyes no longer wary but trusting. "You're not like the others," she said, her voice small but clear. "You're good." Elias's throat tightened, the words hitting deeper than he expected. He knelt to her level, offering a faint smile. "I'm just trying to do what's right," he said. "For you, for Taro, for your mom." Vera's gaze met his, and something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they'd forged, not just through survival, but through shared pain and hope. She reached out, her hand resting on his arm, her touch warm and steady. "You've given us more than safety," she said. "You've given us a home." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elias felt it settle in his chest, filling a void he'd carried for years. He stood, helping Vera move Taro back to the cabin, Lila trailing behind, her jaw clutched tightly, as if it could anchor her to this moment. Inside, they settled Taro on the cot, Vera checking his splint with the care of a healer who'd never stopped fighting. Elias watched, his heart swelling with a pride he hadn't felt since his days as a scientist, when he believed he could change worlds. That night, the storm held off, the sky clearing to reveal a sea of stars. Elias and Vera sat on the cabin's porch, Lila and Taro asleep inside, their breathing a soft counterpoint to the wind's gentle sigh. The air was cool, the dust settled, and for the first time in days, the world felt still. Elias leaned back, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes tracing the constellations he'd once studied as a younger man. "You see that one," he said, pointing to a cluster of stars that shimmered like a promise. "We called it the Navigator back in the colonies. Said it guided lost ships home." Vera followed his gaze, her silver hair glinting under the starlight. "On Zirin, we had a star we called the Heart," she said. "It pulsed like it was alive. We believed it watched over us, even when we fell." Elias turned to her, his voice low. "Maybe it still does." Vera's eyes met his, and the distance between them seemed to vanish. She leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his, her warmth a quiet fire against the night's chill. "You've given us a new heart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Here with you." Elias's breath caught, the weight of her words sinking deep. He reached for her hand, his fingers entwining with hers, the touch both familiar and new. Her skin was soft, her pulse steady under his thumb, and in that moment, the scars of their past felt less like wounds and more like roots, anchoring them to this place, this life. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was neither rushed nor desperate, but deliberate, a vow sealed under the stars. It was a kiss that spoke of survival, of hope, of a future they could build together. When they parted, Vera's eyes shone, not with tears but with a fierce, quiet joy. "We're not just surviving anymore," she said. "We're growing." Elias nodded, his hand still holding hers. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are." Inside, Lila's drawings adorned the walls, rivers and stars, and figures joined hand in hand. Taro slept, his breathing stronger, his future no longer a question mark. Outside, the earth of Arcturus V lay quiet, its red dust hiding roots that sank deeper with each passing day. Elias looked at Vera, at the cabin, at the stars above, and felt a truth settle in his bones. This was no longer just his farm, his exile. It was their home, their family, their defiance against a world that had tried to break them. And as the wind whispered through the dunes, carrying the promise of storms yet to come, Elias knew they would face them together. Beneath the soil, where no one thought life could take hold, something did. A family, a future, a hope that burned brighter than the stars.